Evening. Looks like we have good stream health tonight. That's good because last night or this morning it was shutting me down. I think it may have had to do um, with Easter Sunday. I hope that's what it was. Okay, so I see a couple of comments from here from BTS Army and from Daniel Mayo. So let me read those. BTS is going to be a huge hit in the very near future. It already is. They've already sold out count them, four stadium performances here in the United States, including the Rose Bowl, which is no small feat. And they've sold out Wimbleton in the UK twice. And so they're on their way to be having a very, very big impact on the world. And Daniel says BTS will have its style of music melting into our culture and playlists from across the world. All artists, including anyone with another style, otherwise will free fall into the past. It's something like that, but they're going to have to step up their game, certainly. And what I'm excited about is the idea of using books as the basis for musical albums. And I think that any artist could pick up that idea, obviously. And, I would certainly be happy to help anybody that wanted to do it on any of Dr. Jung's books or any of the books by Jungian analysts about Dr. Jung's work. And because to me, this is just a hugely valuable teaching opportunity. Hi, Gray. Welcome. Hi, Penelope. You're staying up late tonight. So for those of you who don't know, very quickly, we're talking about the K-pop group BTS, and you can learn something about them from the information under this video. And they have just dropped an album a week ago, Friday, on the 12th of April, called Map of the Soul Persona, which is based on this book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an Introduction by Murray Stein. And so this book, which Murray Stein wrote 20 years ago, is suddenly a bestseller around the world in several languages. And it's available in Korean for Koreans. And the album was number one in 70 countries within 4 hours of its release. And as I understand it, it was number one worldwide last week, according to Billboard. So it's going to be a huge phenomenon. And what these young men have done is they've been doing it for a long time. It's only that I'm slow to pick up on pop culture, I guess, given my age, but they certainly have gotten through to me now, and I love what they're doing. And what they do in their imagery is convey a message like a dream, using very, very powerful imagery. And they make political comments, and they also communicate about mental health, which has always been a taboo. And so they're communicating with 80 million fans around the world. It's probably 160 million by now because of the information that's gone around the world. They were on CBS Sunday Morning the other day, yesterday, I guess it was. My days are running together. And so they've caused me to do one thing, and that is that I've started to offer a basic course in Jungian psychology every day at 10 a.m. I started to do it every day. I think I'm going to have to cut it back to 3 days a week or something like that, because it's really becoming too much. But nonetheless, I'll put a link in the description underneath this video. And so, but if you go to the home page, you will see access to the playlist that I've put together to support the BTS Army. And I've now put about 25 videos in there so that the armies, as they call themselves, can bring themselves up to speed on Jungian psychology. And BTS Army says there are more armies, but not into Twitter and SNS platforms. We are absolutely bigger than we guess. Well, I have no doubt about that. And, I've been scrambling as fast as I can to keep up with what has happened, because the following on this YouTube channel has tripled in the last 3 weeks. And, the demand seems to be high to learn something about Jungian psychology, thanks to BTS and their focus on Dr. Stein's book. So I'm very, very grateful for that. And I'm going to continue to work on that and go back through the other songs in the album, and then go back through some of the previous albums, which also were quite poignant. And one of the albums which is called Wings, I believe, is based on Hermann Hesse's novel Damien, which it was influenced by Jungian psychology as well. So there's a lot of amazing things going on, and these young men are communicating so many different things to our culture right now. It's just incredible what's happening. Gray said, it's amazing to watch these men performing their individuation out as art. Yes, and what's also interesting is that they know they are. I mean, at their age, they're quite young to really know that they're consciously individuating, but they definitely are. And I thought for an introductory piece, the CBS piece yesterday morning, which you can probably find now on YouTube, it was called CBS Sunday Morning. I thought that was a pretty good piece for a first intro of 5 minutes. My wife didn't think that they had enough substance in the intro, but I thought there was a lot of substance conveyed in that. And so I'm very hopeful that, gradually people will understand what they're doing, which is really creating a demand for education. So the BTS armies don't have to be forced to go to school. They don't have to pay to go to school per se, except for the cost of an album maybe. But they're getting drawn into talking about these issues that BTS is raising, and the interaction across the world is bringing up the level of consciousness very fast. And I don't think we know where it's going yet, but it's going somewhere, that's for sure. Daniel says, do something about Alzheimer's, and it's a steep incline. Yeah, maybe they will at some point. I really don't know. I mean, I know that they've spawned a charity where members of BTS armies can make a contribution, and they make a different contribution every month. And I think they did mention that one of the months was for Alzheimer's. So, they're making a difference on that as well. And our BTS Army says, yes, it was good. The sad part is that they depict us as teenager girls, which is most prejudice. Yeah, well, it is prejudicial, of course. And, because here I am, a 72-year-old American with gray hair, and I'm enthusiastic about it. And I think that Gray, who's an educator, thinks that there's some potential here, even though he might not have wrapped his mind around what that potential might be. But I've been trying to figure out for years how to get psychological training into school systems and into schools. And of course, that's very, very difficult if you have to get approvals by school boards and in conservative states and places where different religious factions control. It would be very, very difficult to do. And especially because Dr. Jung does talk about religious issues in his psychology. So theologians have traditionally tried to squash his psychology, and I guess rightfully so, in the sense that he's pointing out that you don't need a creed. You can, if you've had a religious experience as he describes them, then you can go on without a creed. And so let me see. I think I'm going to turn my cell phones off. I'm just learning how to turn my new one off. I've made a few investments in new equipment in the last 2 weeks in order to be able to keep up with the demand for more information. But there, now I've got them off, so we won't hear any more buzzes. So let's see. Andy Oxide says, I know you're obviously on a BTS train, but look at the band Tool. They have been writing songs based on Jung's work for more than 20 years. Well, given that the oldest one is 26 years old, I think that might be a stretch. Maybe Mr. Bang has been writing work like that. I don't know. But, you're talking about a band called Tool. Well, a band called Tool didn't until now get through to my consciousness, and somehow BTS has gotten through. I will look that up and see what I can see from that too, because I think it's a very interesting popular culture phenomenon that's happening, where people involved with pop music can influence the world. And BTS Army says, it's Dad who got me into Dad. He was preparing for a meeting with his co-workers, teachers, analyzing a BTS song called No, and that describes exactly how our school system is going downhill. And it was my something. Grenade says, they write music based on the same thing that Jung talks about in a way, very definitely. And so Andy says, they are way more important to Western Jungian archetypal psychology than BTS. No offense to anyone in here. Well, fine. I mean, it never got through to me before, and I've never heard anybody that's involved in the Jungian community, and I do know a few people. I've never heard any of them mention Tool. So I'm not saying you're not right. I'm only saying the news comes very slowly to where I live. So I'll have, as I say, I'm going to look up this band now that you've mentioned it and see what I think of what they're doing as well. And Grenade says, lots of music and entertainment follows certain common themes or archetypes. It's literally everywhere. Yes, I agree. And all good art should be doing that, because if you're not doing that, then you're not really doing art, because you're not going to break through. I mean, the little ladies that go to my local adult ed classes for drawing or painting and who are doing a still life, they're trying to be a camera. And that's not art unless you're doing trompe l'oeil. And if you're doing trompe l'oeil, that's a different thing. But aside from that, it's not really art what they're doing. I mean, it may work for your grandchildren to put on their refrigerator, but that's about it, I think. And so BTS Army says it's how people relate to the message. Yes. And Gray says, yes, the Tool song 46-2 is so cool. Okay, I'll look that up also. Okay. And Art Patterson says, do you think that N, I don't know your point here. Daniel, looks like they may just be able to become as popular as the Beatles. It certainly appears that way, because they've broken certain records that have stood since the Beatles. So that's pretty impressive, actually. Andy says, great, 46-2 is totally Nietzsche. That's also have a whole album called Anima, okay? Do you think that BTS is being used by God to heal the world? Yes, I do think that. And Grenade says, art is subjective in my opinion, but mass appeal is not. Well, mass appeal certainly is subjective in certain ways because it provides a projection for the unconscious, which is from the subjective. And Grace says, we are all being used by God. It's just if we are consciously aware of it. Precisely, Gray. I agree entirely on that. And so what is happening? Well, we have opposites. One of the basic ideas in Jungian psychology is opposites. And our society has gotten very, very gruffly masculine in the last 25 years since we've been fighting in the Middle East and Afghanistan particularly. And I think that BTS is a compensation for that. It's a need that was unconsciously felt across the world. And Kim Namjoon and Mr. Bang and the other members of the BTS group have somehow clicked into that need at an unconscious level, perhaps, to begin with. And so, I don't know, Daniel, is the Tool group, do they present themselves as androgynous like BTS does? What we saw after, particularly after the 2003 Iraq War, but we actually saw it start to emerge after Gulf War I, was that American men who very rarely wore beards in the modern era started to wear beards like Arabs do typically. And I personally have resisted it, even though I traveled many times to the Middle East. But I felt the urge to do it, and I know many men succumbed and did grow beards, and still have them. And so, what's happening? Well, one of the things is that I think that there's a reaction to a pure logos, which is what Jordan Peterson sells. And I was thinking, so pure rationality and pure masculine way of thinking about things. And it came to me in fits and starts over the last week. If you were here last Monday, you saw how I reacted pretty rawly to the loss of Notre Dame. And but that brought me a kind of epiphany, which is that, we certainly need the logos in our world. We can't have any product without logos, and having the rules for producing that product, whether it's a pen or an iPhone or what have you, we can't have those products unless they're built 100% to the rules. And men have traditionally been guided that way, toward rules. And so when Jordan Peterson says, I'm going to give you the rules, men are attracted to that because they want rules. They want guidance on how they should live their lives and be successful. And but the problem is the world doesn't run on rules. I mean, at a certain level it does, but beyond that, it doesn't. So one example is the U.S. Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is a purely logos organization. There's no room for a dissenting opinion. Okay, we seem to have good stream health going out. I hope that's the case when I start seeing it on YouTube. They seem to have a different perspective here. Because I'm not seeing it come back online. And so let me just mention in the chat. Okay, I will stop one more time, attempting to stop one more time. Okay, we seem to have good stream health again for a moment, and I hope you're here. I'm going to continue with tonight's lesson, and I will react to your comments going forward. And so I'll put in the chat, welcome back, and I'll react to your comments going forward. Okay, and so this might end up having to be an edited session at some point in the future. All right, so let me go back, because on March 25th now, we were in lesson 6 of talking about this book, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. And I'm here to respond to your comments and questions, but if there's nothing to respond to, then I'm going to provide you with this information. So we're up to paragraph 26 of Psychology and Alchemy, which is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And I'm going to reread paragraph 25 and then read paragraph 26. Last time on May the 25th, we went through paragraph 25 in great detail. And so I'm simply going to read it to remind you of what was in it. And then I'm going to read through paragraph 26 and then come back and talk about the detail in paragraph 26. So, right. Okay, so paragraph 25. This is Psychology and Alchemy. And this is from a part of this book called Introduction to the Religious, which goes up to paragraph 43. Paragraph 25. Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil into a world problem, and by formulating the conflict dogmatically, raised it to an absolute principle. Into this, as yet unresolved conflict, the Christian is cast as a protagonist of good, a fellow player in the world drama. Understood in its deepest sense, being Christ's follower involves a suffering that is unendurable to the great majority of mankind. Consequently, the example of Christ is in reality followed either with reservation or not at all, and the pastoral practice of the Church even finds itself obliged to lighten the yoke of Christ. This means a pretty considerable reduction in the severity and harshness of the conflict, and hence, in practice, a relativism of good and evil. Good is equivalent to the unconditional imitation of Christ, and evil is its hindrance. Man's moral weakness and sloth are what chiefly hinder the imitation, and it is these that probabilism extends to practical understanding, which may sometimes, perhaps, come nearer to Christian tolerance, mildness, and love of one's neighbor than the attitude of those who see the probabilism a mere laxity. Although one must concede a number of cardinal Christian virtues to the probabilist endeavor, one must still not overlook the fact that it obviates much of the suffering involved in the imitation of Christ, and that the conflict of good and evil is thus robbed of its harshness and toned down to tolerable proportions. This brings about an approach to the psychic archetype of the self, where even these opposites seem to be united, though, as I say, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. For the latter, there is a rift running through the world. Light wars against night, and the upper against the lower. The two are not one, as they are in the psychic archetype. But even though religious dogma may condemn the idea of two being one, religious practice does, as we have seen, allow the natural psychological symbol of the self at one with itself an approximate means of expression. On the one hand, dogma insists that three are one, while denying that four are one. Since olden times, not only in the West but also in China, uneven numbers have been regarded as masculine and even numbers as feminine. The Trinity is therefore a decidedly masculine deity, of which the androgyny of Christ and the special position and veneration accorded to the Mother of God are not the real equivalent. So that was paragraph 25. Now, the one I'm going to talk about in detail tonight is paragraph 26, which is, with this statement, which may strike the reader as peculiar, we come to one of the central axioms of alchemy, namely the saying of Maria Prophetessa, one becomes two, two becomes three, and out of the third comes the one as the fourth. As the reader has already seen from its title, this book is concerned with the psychological significance of alchemy, and thus with a problem which, with very few exceptions, has so far eluded scientific research. Until quite recently, science was interested only in the part that alchemy played in the history of chemistry, concerning its very little with concerning itself very little with the part it played in the history of philosophy and religion. The importance of alchemy for the historical development of chemistry is obvious, but its cultural importance is still so little known that it seems almost impossible to say in a few words wherein that consisted. In this introduction, therefore, I have attempted to outline the religious and psychological problems which are germane to the theme of alchemy. The point is that alchemy is rather like an undercurrent to the Christianity that ruled on the surface. It is to this surface as the dream is to consciousness. I'll read that one more time. It is to this surface as the dream is to consciousness. And just as the dream compensates the conflicts of the conscious mind, so alchemy endeavors to fill in the gaps left open by the Christian tension of opposites. Perhaps the most pregnant expression of this is the axiom of Maria Prophetessa, quoted above, which runs like a leitmotif throughout almost the whole of the lifetime of alchemy, extending over more than 17 centuries. In this aphorism, the even numbers, which signify the feminine principle, earth, and regions under the earth, and evil itself, are interpolated between the uneven numbers of the Christian dogma. They are personified by the serpens Mercurii, the dragon that creates and destroys itself and represents the prima materia. This fundamental idea of alchemy points back to the Tehom, to Tiamat with her dragon attribute, and thus to the primordial matriarchal world, which, in the theomachy of the Marduk myth, was overthrown by the masculine world of the father. Now remember, Tiamat is very heavily discussed by Jordan Peterson in Maps of Meaning, in his book Maps of Meaning. The historical shift in the world's consciousness toward the masculine is compensated at first by the chthonic femininity of the unconscious. In certain pre-Christian religions, the differentiation of the masculine principle had taken the form of the father-son specification, a change which was to be of the utmost importance for Christianity. Were the unconscious merely complementary, this shift of consciousness would have been accompanied by the production of a mother and daughter, for which the necessary material lay ready at hand in the myth of Demeter and Persephone. But, as alchemy shows, the unconscious chose rather the Sibyl Atthis type in the form of the prima materia and the filius macrocosmi, thus providing that it is not complementary but compensatory. This goes to show that the unconscious does not simply act contrary to the conscious mind, but modifies it more in the manner of the opponent or partner. The son type does not call up a daughter as a complementary image from the depths of the chthonic unconscious. It calls up another son. This remarkable fact would seem to be connected with the incarnation of our earthly human nature, of a purely spiritual God, brought about by the Holy Ghost impregnating the womb of the Blessed Virgin. Thus the higher, the spiritual, the masculine, inclines to the lower, the earthy, the feminine, and accordingly the mother, who was anterior to the world of the father, accommodates herself to the masculine principle, and with the aid of the human spirit, alchemy or philosophy, produces a son, not the antithesis of Christ, but rather his chthonic counterpart, not a divine man, but a fabulous being conforming to the nature of the primordial mother. And just as the redemption of the man in the microcosm is the task of the upper son, so the lower son has the function of Salvator Macrocosmi, the savior of the macrocosm. Okay, so that's the end of paragraph 26. Now I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about this. And Gray, you've heard this before, I think, because I was talking about the axiom of Maria in the advanced group. Great comments about chaos herself. Well, I'm of a mind now, I'm starting to be of a mind that we have wounded ourselves in the foot by trying to create two big containers and forcing every set of opposites into one or the other container, because that isn't really fair, because we require rationality from women. If a woman is involved in making an automobile, she's every bit as much involved in rationality as a man is, and so when we force things to say, okay, you're either in the masculine or the feminine pot, we get into trouble, I think. And when we see it in our politics, we have this huge medicine ball that we're pushing around the field, and eventually every election day it comes crashing down from our arms held up over our heads with the medicine ball on it, and then we find out what the throw of the dice is for the collective unconscious during that 2 or 4 year period. And so I want to go back to this idea of the axiom of Maria, because I think it's very significant, and it's about how the logos tends to discern, so it tends to split things up over time, and sometimes it takes a long time to split things, but I think if we look at religion, the first split in Christianity, well, first there was the split from Judaism, which was the first Christians, and so what happens is there's one thing, it was Judaism, and Judaism brought all this cultural history forward in literature up until the time of Christ only, or not only, but it was not challenged up until the time of Christ per se, not in big enough terms for us to talk about. But at the time of Christ, there was a discernment and a split off. And so Christianity really was a Jewish heresy. And so there was one becomes two. That's the first step in the axiom of Maria. Then when you have two, then you might have a pushing and pulling back and forth between that pair of opposites. And what happens ultimately, that tension has to be resolved. And so you have a thesis, an antithesis, and then there needs to be a synthesis where the two have to find some common ground so that they can hold together and be part of the same world. And so you get this synthesis. And then once you have this synthesis, whatever it is, so let's call it Judeo-Christian thought, once you have that synthesis, that third thing, then that becomes a one again. And it's one with a new level of consciousness, a new dimension of consciousness. And so what's represented by the fourth is a one at a new dimension. So now instead of Judaism, and instead of Judaism versus Christianity, then we have Judeo-Christian, and then that ball of Judeo-Christian came along through time, and it started to get sliced up. First it was, various different groups. And one of those was the Gnostics. And so what did the church do? The church basically burned all the heretics at the stake. So every time there was a discernment and a splitting off from the Christian ball, suddenly, those people were just destroyed, and time went on, and then there would be another one, and then there would be another Inquisition, and the church was always trying to stay in control. And so even into Dr. Jung's time, where the church recognized Dr. Jung as a threat. Why did they recognize him as a threat? Because he knew their secret, and their secret was that it is possible to have a direct experience with God. You don't have to have it intermediated by a rabbi, a priest, or a minister, or a mullah, or whatever, a monk, whatever it is. So it doesn't need to be intermediated. You can have a direct experience. And so that was Gnosticism. And so, yes, Dr. Jung was of that school of thought in the sense that he said, and correctly so, I believe, in my opinion, that you cannot grok, or you cannot fully appreciate any concept in psychology until you've experienced it personally. And so, it comes up in Ion, my favorite paragraph in Ion, where Dr. Jung is talking about zoological criticism of the duck-billed platypus. Well, you can write 2 volumes of specifications about the life of the duck-billed platypus, but you'll never touch the experience of being a duck-billed platypus. So, you can think you know something about that creature, but actually you don't, because you haven't had that experience. And so religion works the same way. You either have the experience or you have to do this belief thing, and it gets harder and harder to believe as we come down through history, because the stories that are told in church started to fall away in the 16th century. And so Galileo could look through his telescope and see that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, for example. But many, many other scientific discoveries came along, but the problem is that they all came based on the scientific method. And the scientific method, its flaw is that it holds all variables constant. It takes them out of the equation. So the variables represent the irrationality. And when you rule that out, when you rule the variables out, then all you get is this rigid rationality that doesn't, it maybe has blinkers on. And so obviously it worked very effectively because it gave us all the wonderful things that we have in our society today.